When I first heard that King Charles had decided to travel to Mecca, I didn't believe it, not because he couldn't, but because I never imagined a man born into palaces, wrapped in titles, and surrounded by ceremony would willingly walk into a place where every soul stands equal before God. But that's exactly what he did. And let me tell you something, that decision alone said more about humility than any royal decree ever could. I've spent my whole career watching people, powerful people, hide behind excuses, but when I looked at Charles preparing for this journey, I saw something I rarely see in men of his stature: sincerity. There were no cameras, no PR handlers, no speeches about goodwill. It was quiet, private, almost sacred. He'd been studying Islam privately for years, they say, reading the Quran in silence, visiting scholars and asking questions that shook him more than the answers did. And one night, after a long walk through his gardens in Scotland, he said something to his aide that changed everything. If truth is one, then I need to see where 1 billion people bow to it. That's how it began, not as a political gesture, but as a personal search. I imagine him standing by his window that night looking at the stars, realizing that titles, crowns, and histories mean nothing when your soul is restless. You can rule nations and still lose yourself if you don't rule your heart. So he made arrangements, quietly, respectfully, through the right channels. It wasn't simple. Mecca is sacred ground, not a tourist destination, and for someone like King Charles to step there meant crossing the boundaries of privilege and entering a world where his name carried no weight. I heard he was nervous, and I believe that. You don't approach holiness without trembling a little. The day he left, London was grey, the kind of sky that reminds you how small you are under heaven. His entourage was stripped down to the essentials: no velvet, no medals, just simple clothing and a face that carried more questions than answers. And when that plane landed in Saudi Arabia, something in him changed. Witnesses said he didn't speak for hours, just stared out the window as the desert stretched endless and golden, a horizon so ancient it made Buckingham Palace feel like a recent rumor. I can almost hear his thoughts. All my life I've been bowed to. Now it's my turn to bow. The first steps in Mecca are not just footsteps, they're confessions. Every pilgrim who walks that path carries a weight, and Charles carried centuries of kingship, empire, and ego. But Mecca doesn't care about your lineage. It only asks what's in your heart. When he entered the holy city, dressed in the simple white cloth of Iram, the uniform of equality, there were no guards, no trumpets, no signs of royalty, only the hum of prayers rising from every direction. They said he looked around like a man seeing the world for the first time, his eyes wet, his lips trembling, his posture unsure, as if the crown had suddenly grown heavy with meaning he never understood before. Judge all you want, but in that moment, Charles wasn't a monarch. He was a man stripped down to his essence. He watched the pilgrims move around the Kaaba, thousands circling in unison, chanting words older than any kingdom, and I think he realized that true power doesn't come from control, it comes from surrender. I've seen people fake humility, but this was different. His aide said he kept whispering, "It's alive, this place is alive." Maybe for the first time he felt what it means to belong to something eternal. I can imagine his hands trembling as he lifted them in prayer, not knowing the exact words, but feeling them all the same, the gratitude, the guilt, the awe. And I'll tell you this, when you watch a man who's lived his life above others finally look up to something higher, you're witnessing justice in its purest form. That's why I say this journey wasn't about religion, it was about revelation. Every monarch is taught to hold the world. Mecca teaches you to let go of it. As he walked the marble floors under the blazing sun, surrounded by millions dressed just like him, his titles melted away. There was no "Your Majesty," only "Brother," and you could see it in his face, that strange mix of confusion and peace, like a man finally meeting his own soul after decades of separation. He stopped before the Kaaba, that black cube that hums with centuries of devotion, and for a long time he didn't move. He just stood there breathing, absorbing, remembering. Some say he wept. I believe it, because when truth hits you, it doesn't ask permission, it just breaks you open. And somewhere between those tears and those prayers, King Charles began to understand something no crown ever taught him, that greatness isn't measured by what you rule, but by what you revere. People talk about leadership and legacy. Well, I think he found both on that pilgrimage, not in speeches or ceremonies, but in silence, in the sound of millions whispering, "Labbaik Allahumma labbaik, here I am, oh Lord, here I am." I can almost hear Judge Judy's tone here, sharp, clear, unwavering, because she doesn't waste words on flattery. She'd say, finally, a king who learned how to kneel, and that's the truth. Because before you can lead men, you must learn to follow truth, and that's exactly what Mecca teaches, to strip away every illusion until what's left is sincerity. By the time he left that courtyard, he wasn't the same man who had landed days before. The cameras weren't rolling, but heaven was watching. And if you ask me, That's the real audience that matters. This wasn't just King Charles's journey. It was humanity's reminder that faith isn't inherited, it's discovered. And discovery, my friends, begins when pride ends. When I tell you what King Charles saw inside Mecca, I want you to understand this wasn't some royal tour or spiritual sightseeing trip. This was a confrontation between ego and eternity. From the moment he stepped onto the marble of the Grand Mosque, you could almost sense the weight of centuries peeling off his shoulders. The sound alone, the rhythmic hum of a million voices, the echo of the Adhan cutting through the desert air, shook him in ways no cathedral ever had. And I'll tell you this, a man who's lived his entire life being bowed to suddenly standing among people who bow only to God, that's a collision no crown prepares you for. He stood there surrounded by every race, every language, every face equal in that sea of white cloth, and I imagine he finally grasped what equality actually means. You can pass all the laws you want, hold all the conferences on diversity you like, but you'll never understand unity until you've seen people cry side by side with strangers, circling a house made not of gold or glass, but of devotion. They said, Charles whispered, so this is surrender, and I think that's the first time he ever truly understood that word. Because surrender isn't weakness, it's wisdom. It's the moment you realize control is just an illusion and faith is the only real anchor in a storm. I've seen men fake reverence, but he didn't. He touched the Kaaba like a man touches the truth, gently, fearfully, gratefully. I imagine him thinking about his ancestors, the empire, the wars fought in God's name, the centuries of division, and for a fleeting moment, maybe he wondered if all of it was worth it. Because when you're standing before that sacred cube, history feels smaller than a grain of sand. Mecca humbles you. It breaks the false mirrors we build for ourselves. He watched people weeping on marble, hands raised, voices trembling with prayers they'd saved a lifetime to say, and it got to him. One of his guards later said he saw the king sit down quietly in a corner, no throne, no servants, just Charles the man whispering, this is the real kingdom. And that's the thing. Faith doesn't care how high your walls are, it finds you anyway. Later, he met an old pilgrim from Nigeria who had walked barefoot just to reach that place. The man didn't know who Charles was, and when someone tried to tell him, he laughed and said, before God, we're all the same, my son. That one sentence hit him harder than any royal lecture ever could. I can almost hear Judge Judy saying, well, that's justice right there, divine justice, the kind you don't appeal, the kind that changes you from the inside out. And she'd be right, because that's exactly what happened. Every prayer call became a reminder that time doesn't belong to kings, it belongs to the Creator. 5 times a day, he'd pause, sit still, and listen as millions aligned themselves to one purpose. No meetings, no luxury, no distractions, just pure synchronization between body, soul, and heaven. That rhythm seeps into you. It rearranges your heartbeat. He told one scholar later that it felt like the entire world was exhaling in peace. And then came Medina. If Mecca is the flame, Medina is the light. They say Charles entered the prophet's city with tears still drying on his cheeks. The air there is different, softer, almost kind. You can feel it the moment you arrive, like the city itself is breathing with mercy. The Prophet Muhammad's mosque stands not in grandeur, but in grace. And even someone unfamiliar with its history can feel the sanctity that lives in its silence. Charles sat quietly inside Al-Masjid an-Nabawi, his hands clasped, his eyes fixed on the people around him, men reading the Quran, children learning verses, elders whispering prayers for their families. And I'll tell you, for a man used to protocol and hierarchy, to sit shoulder to shoulder with laborers, farmers, teachers, and beggars, it rewires your understanding of worth. He wasn't King Charles there, he was just another soul seeking connection. One of the scholars who spoke with him said the king kept repeating, there's peace here, not the kind you negotiate, the kind you feel, and that right there is what Medina gives you. It's not a lecture, it's a lullaby for the heart. In Mecca, your ego burns. In Medina, your soul heals. That's the balance Islam has kept for over 1,000 years, fire and mercy, discipline and compassion, justice and love. Charles walked those corridors where the Prophet once walked, watched people feeding strangers, helping the elderly, teaching children to recite God's words, and I think something inside him broke, not in pain, but in awakening. Because for the first time, he wasn't being served, he was serving something greater. I'm told he even joined in distributing food to pilgrims one night, wearing a simple cloak, no guards in sight, and nobody recognized him. They just saw another man helping, smiling, saying, peace be upon you, like everyone else. And maybe that anonymity felt like freedom, the kind no palace could offer. When he finally stood before the Prophet's resting place, he didn't speak for a long time. He just stood there, eyes closed, his lips moving silently. Some say he prayed, some say he wept. But what I know for sure is that when he walked out of that mosque, his face had changed. It wasn't just the exhaustion or the emotion. It was the look of someone who'd finally found what he'd been searching for his entire life. And you know what? That's what faith does. It finds you in the noise, holds you still, and says you belong. Judge Judy would have called it divine order, because after all the arguments, all the debates, all the pomp and ceremony, the truth doesn't need a judge. It proves itself. Charles's journey through Mecca and Medina wasn't about conversion or politics. It was about collision between what he was taught and what he felt, between a lifetime of duty and a moment of divine honesty. And when you experience that, you don't go back the same. You can't, because once your heart has heard the call, silence anywhere else sounds hollow. When King Charles returned from his pilgrimage, the world expected a press conference, a statement, some royal words polished by advisors, but what they got instead was silence, the kind that speaks louder than speeches. Judge Judy would have said, sometimes silence is the only honest testimony, and she'd be right, because the man who stepped back onto British soil wasn't the same man who'd left it. The photographer saw it before anyone else did. His eyes no longer carried the weight of ceremony, but the calm of someone who had stood in front of truth and let it rewrite him. The palace walls, once symbols of grandeur, now felt like echo chambers of old noise. He walked slower, spoke softer, and when his staff asked him about the trip, he said, it was not a trip, it was a trial, and I passed only by grace. That's the thing about encounters with the divine. They strip you down. They make you see how small you are and how merciful the universe still is. Charles started spending more time in reflection, less banquets, more books, less applause, more prayer. He began inviting scholars, imams, priests, and rabbis to the same table, not for diplomacy, but for dialogue. And for once, it didn't look like politics, it looked like peace in action. I imagine Judge Judy narrating it like a closing argument. Ladies and gentlemen, after all the titles and tributes, the only verdict that matters is whether a man's heart has learned humility. She'd say it, pause, look straight into the camera, and let the weight of it settle. Because Charles had learned humility, not the kind that's rehearsed, but the kind you earn through tears, heat, and miles walked in devotion. He started supporting humanitarian projects in the Middle East quietly, with no headlines, no publicists. They said he donated anonymously to rebuild homes near the desert towns where pilgrims rest. And every night he'd read passages from the Quran beside his Bible, not as contradiction, but as continuation. You see, he didn't come back to declare a conversion. He came back to declare a comprehension that God's mercy is bigger than the walls we build around his name. The British press tried to analyze his calm. The tabloids called it a spiritual shift, but I'd call it what Judge Judy would, a man finally meeting himself without his title. His sons noticed it too. They said he laughed more often, hugged longer, and when he spoke of leadership, he spoke of service, not sovereignty. And that's the paradox of faith. The higher you rise in humility, the freer you become. Mecca had burned away the arrogance. Medina had filled the ashes with mercy. Now back home, he carried both fire and light within him. During one public address, he said softly, I've seen the world where every man is equal before his creator, and I wish that spirit to live in us all. It wasn't royal rhetoric, it was revelation. People didn't clap right away, they listened, because sincerity has a sound, and once you've heard it, you can't mistake it for anything else. The world, in its noise and conflict, needed that reminder that faith isn't a costume, it's a compass. And Charles had found his true north not in Buckingham Palace, but in the desert of Mecca. Judge Judy would have finished her monologue with that signature steal in her voice saying, it takes courage to face a courtroom, but it takes divine courage to face your own soul, and that's exactly what he did. She'd probably point out that justice and mercy aren't opposites, they're partners, and maybe, just maybe, that's what the king finally understood. The man who once symbolized power now embodied peace. He no longer wanted to rule minds, he wanted to reach hearts. You could see it in the way he paused during national prayers, the way he listened instead of lecturing, the way his voice trembled when he mentioned the word faith. He even began restoring old mosques across the Commonwealth, not for show, but for reverence. And when someone asked him why, he simply replied, because they are houses of God, and God's house belongs to everyone. That right there is spiritual evolution. The king who once represented crowns now represented connection. It's poetic justice, the kind